This is the best
Do you hear me?
of the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
Welcome back. Glad you are here. Certainly, for those of you watching on television, we just played a montage of the SEC Big 12 Challenge, and one of the coaches who played a big role in that victory is Avery Johnson, the head coach at Alabama. His team, just an incredible win at home at Coleman Coliseum over Oklahoma. Coach, I know you got to move on as a football coach, but if you bear with me for just a second, can we go back to Saturday afternoon? I know what you said then. Describe again to the audience who perhaps did not hear you afterwards. How important was that?
Paul, it was very important, and thanks for having me on. One, we were representing the SEC, and that's a big deal right now, representing the SEC in basketball, not football or any other sport, but basketball. This is what we dreamed of, a couple of years ago when a bunch of us came into the conference as new coaches to go along with the coaches that were senior members of the conference. We wanted SEC basketball to mean something. And then, for Alabama to be on center stage, on ESPN, playing against one of the hottest players, arguably in the last 5-10 years in college basketball, and Trae Young in Oklahoma, and to have the type of crowd that we had in our building. And for a lot of our folks that have been around Alabama basketball, they said that's the best crowd we've had in the best last 10 or 15 years. So to be a part of that, it was really special.
In terms of getting over the hump, and I say that, but your team has done it before. You beat Auburn not long ago. Help us better understand what it took, because, that was a ferociously good team. You mentioned Trae, but your team came back and performed when they had to win that game.
It was great because I know the focus was on Young and our point guard, Colin Sexton, but I love the way our guys were laser focused for a longer stretch of time in that game. We've been a little inconsistent, especially on the road. I don't know which team is going to show up, and I guess that's what happens when you have 5 freshmen in your rotation and a couple of sophomores and you're the 4th youngest team in the country. The expectations are higher, but our guys were locked in. They understood the game plan. We didn't make as many multiple mistakes on offense and defense. We finished the game strong. We had a togetherness and a chemistry that was really at a high level. So it was fun to watch. The big question is just, can we duplicate it? Because we're playing against a Missouri team on Wednesday that's beat South Carolina, beat Tennessee, lost a couple of close games, won at Arkansas, and they can really get it going. So we'll see what happens Wednesday at 8 o'clock.
And that's always the challenge, Coach. You can't look too deep into the schedule. After that, you got Florida. Ultimately, you'll make a trip to Kentucky. So, I know that fans like to look ahead. Coaches look, next game? Can you really look any farther than that?
No, you can't look any further, especially this year in the SEC, because there are really no off nights. This year in our conference, we're projected to have 8 or 9 teams in the NCAA tournament, which would be an amazing accomplishment for our league. So there are no off nights, and all we're focused on right now is not our previous game, but we're focusing on Missouri. We're all in on Missouri. It's 20-hour days. We can't feel like anybody's outworking us. Our players got to be rested and ready. And because Missouri, they're a good rebounding team. Geis and Robertson are some outstanding guards. We've seen what Pure Year can do on the floor, especially last year in the SEC tournament. They got some other nice young bigs, and Jonte Porter. I know Michael Porter's out for the year. So we have to be ready to go and continue to protect our home court.
Coach, I know what you said, but you're also dealing with young people and you're dealing with a fan base. I'm guessing you're still talking about Saturday. How big a challenge is that? You face it as a player, as a coach in the NBA. You face it now, but you still have to do it, don't you?
Yeah, and it started yesterday in practice, Paul, because we had one of our hardest practices of the year. And I'm looking to have some carryover So we basically had to, kind of detox them of what happened on Saturday, and let's get back to work, because we obviously still didn't play a perfect game. There were some errors in that game that are correctable. But I just think for me, it's all about staying kind of glass half full, because we've had some very disappointing losses this year, but at the same time, we've had some incredible wins, and sometimes that's the roller coaster of dealing with a very young team.
Coach Johnson, I realize you can only be responsible for your team, but you alluded to the SEC a minute ago, and you were part of this new movement in the SEC, bringing in a higher caliber head coach. You came in a couple of years ago, and I know that the goal has been to get to the tournament, which you're certainly inching toward right now. But I am interested, as someone who is also an ESPN analyst, to look at the other 13 schools. And what do you see other than difficult opponents every night? What do you think the big difference in the SEC has been lately versus a couple of years ago?
A great question, Paul, and I think there are several factors. One, outstanding coaches. Obviously, we all compete against each other, but I think we all have a healthy sense of respect for one another. We may not be best friends. I'm really close friends with Billy Kennedy, because obviously he took a chance on Avery Jr. several years ago, and Avery Jr. spent his freshman year at Texas A&M. But I would say the coaches in our league are really good coaches, outstanding coaches. I think we've recruited better across the board. And whether it's been the high-level guys or guys that have kind of been in the middle, and coaches have done a good job of not only recruiting them but developing those players. And we've also scheduled better. A lot of us, our non-conference schedules have significantly improved, and we won our share of games. And, you look at the Big 12 SEC Challenge, we won it this year. And while some may not think that's a big deal, I think it is. I think it is when you're talking about SEC basketball, because a lot of us haven't been in situations like Kentucky, for example, that have had, a level consistency since Cal got there. The rest of us, we're trying to make a name for ourselves. So I thought that Big 12 SEC Challenge, and with us winning it 6-4, it could have easily been 7-3. I thought that was a pretty huge accomplishment for us.
In relation to the tournament, when we were together in Nashville, seemed like forever ago, it was back in October, talk about 6-7 in the NCAA tournament. It sounded good, but I think some people were skeptical, saying that's just the SEC trying to promote its brand. But that's not the case any longer. How important is it, first for your team, and secondly for the rest of the league to make a big number and then advance in this tournament?
Well, I think my buddy Frank Martin at South Carolina tried to warn everybody even last year. Here they were in a situation where, they got knocked out of the SEC tournament, and he was trying to educate people on how tough our conference is, dating back to last year, and what was on the horizon for this year. So as coaches around the league, we know, maybe some of the other teams that's not getting as much attention, how good Mississippi State is. Look at Auburn this year. I know they are in-state rivalry, but we have to give them respect, and we respected them when they came here to play us at home. They're a ranked team, and now Kentucky's back in. Tennessee's been steady this year. Arkansas, they're really good. Florida's been consistent. So I can keep going on and on. And, Vanderbilt was struggling, but they had a big win against TCU in the SEC Big 12 Challenge. So, again, there's just no easy nights because of what's happening from the coaches on down. And also, just like at Coleman Coliseum on Saturday afternoon, look at the fans that are coming out to support, the sellouts. We've had 3 straight sellouts, and not only do our fans show up, but they make a lot of noise, and you see that across the SEC.
Coach, congratulations again. Best wishes tomorrow night against Mizzou and the rest of the way. We always appreciate your time.
Okay, thanks a lot, Paul.
Thank you so much. Avery Johnson, always kind and gracious with his time. We appreciate it. We have more to come later on. Number of guests. We'll talk about some hoops with Tim Brando later in the program as well. We'll take a short break here. Back to your calls.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
Glad you are here, and let's check in with Daryl in Georgia.
Well, Paul, Avery Johnson, he's a heck of a guy, ain't he?
Sure is.
He has to have the utmost respect for you. Would you agree with that? I mean, you got to know that when his phone, he has to know when his phone rings, okay, for an interview, it's either one or two people. It's either the Finebaum show or it's Josh. All damn or all the time. I mean, Paul, when are the Alabama fans going to stop beating their chest on social media about how great they are? I mean, I got a show about the officiating, that's fine, but I still have to sit here and hear them beat them chest. I wish they would spread the wealth a little bit, okay, and give more credit, to where credit's due, like give some credit to Ohio State for beating Wisconsin. Kind of helped them out. They would never got anything to beat Ohio State. I mean, they couldn't win their state title or their conference title on their own. They got some help winning the national title. All the thing Georgia, too, for beating Auburn. Because we know if Auburn would have beat Georgia and Auburn gets in, Auburn would have got in, Alabama wouldn't have beat them in the playoff or the
Daryl, let me pause here for a moment, okay?
Hold on. Nick Saban has never beaten Auburn when he had a good football team. So how could you think he would beat them now? It's highly probable that he would not. He has yet to beat them with a good football team.
Do you realize how poorly this is resonating with the rest of the nation?
Well, you know why? Let me tell you something. In 2013, I swore, okay, after that game that I was done. I was not going to invest no more of my soul and mind into a football game for a school that I never attended in a game that I had no control over, and I'll be damned if it didn't happen again, okay? Gut wrench. I did not sit the entire time in that football game. With 10 minutes left in the fourth quarter, my girlfriend can attest to this, with 10 minutes left in the fourth quarter, I said, you know what? I was talking to Coach Smart. I know he couldn't hear me. I was like, what in the effing are you doing, okay? Well, you're blowing it. I mean, why are you trying to run the clock out?
Get it out. It'll be cathartic, okay? Keep talking.
Well, I mean, I was like, why are you trying to run the clock out? You can't do that with your I don't even understand.
If you want to stand up and scream, go ahead, Daryl. Just get it out of your system.
My wife. I went to my girlfriend 10 minutes after the game and told her, I said, Georgia's going to lose. They're going to lose. And you know what? It wasn't the offense coordinator's fault.
Are you standing up right now?
I got a question for you.
I want you to stand up and put your arms out. I mean, let it go. Let it go. Get those demons out of the body.
This is like breaking up with a girlfriend that you love, okay? It's a bad thing.
I mean, this is a live exorcism right here.
I asked you a question. Is there any truth to the rumor that you are going to be moving to Atlanta?
Daryl, you know my policy on rumors.
You need to be in Atlanta. That right there is you're great enough now. That's the ultimate. That's exactly where you need to be. Is in Atlanta, Georgia. You're only an hour away from Athens, an hour away from Durham, Columbus.
Now, Daryl, do you expect me to answer that?
Oliver Gray was up in Atlanta, Paul.
Do you expect me to answer this question?
No, I don't expect you to answer this question, but I hope it happens. And I hope you end up at the College Football Hall of Fame because that's where the show deserves to reside at, by all means. I hope that happens. I don't know if it's going to happen. I heard it might happen, and it should happen. We'll have to see.
Daryl, one last question, Daryl. I mean, do you feel better?
No, I don't feel better, Paul. Just like I did in 2013. I feel just like I did in 2013.
This is going to be a process. I can tell right now. This is going to be. Would you mind coming to our studio so we can have an intervention? We're going to invite a priest. We welcome all of you back from the radio. We were talking on TV about the challenges of this conference and how so many different schools and people have overcome them, and we're just so happy to welcome Andrew Maraniss to the program. He is the second time he's been with us. He wrote the book "Strong Inside: Perry Wallace in the Collision of Race and Sports" in the SEC, and we're so Andrew, thanks so much. Really great to talk to you again. This was a New York Times bestseller, and I want to start with this event in D.C. a couple of weeks ago that David Williams told us about. I've talked to other people who were there. What was the backstory on the celebration?
Well, thanks again for having me on your show. And, that was a really special event in D.C. at the new Smithsonian Museum, African American History and Culture Museum. Commissioner Sankey was there. And, as you've mentioned, this is the 50th anniversary of the color line being broken in the SEC with Nat Northington at Kentucky, with Perry Wallace on the Vanderbilt basketball team. And so Vanderbilt has been doing a number of activities over the course of this year to honor that legacy. And so one of the events was this event in D.C. To talk about what Perry had done as a pioneer, to show about 30 minutes of a new documentary that has been made on Perry's story. And then also Chancellor Zeppos from Vanderbilt announced the creation of a new Center for Sports and Society. at Vanderbilt, which will continue to look at these issues, not only how they played out in the past, but also the present and the future. These issues that Perry experienced as a pioneer are still with us in many ways.
I want to pick up on that because Chancellor Zeppos is certainly one of the premier leaders in intercollegiate athletics, but this is such an interesting concept here. Explain to some of us lay people exactly what will happen.
With the center, yes. So, I think this is one of the really interesting things that's happened with Perry Wallace and his relationship with Vanderbilt, which was strained for a long time. He graduated in 1970. He was never invited back to the school for almost 20 years. But what you've seen over the last 10 years or so, before Perry passed away, unfortunately, on December 1st, was a real coming together. And you had leaders like David Williams and Chancellor Zeppos making important moves to improve that relationship, to build Perry's story and his experience into the current Vanderbilt experience. The freshmen each of the last 2 years here have been required to read my book, which a number of them had a chance to meet Perry and to express how much he meant to them. And so what you've seen is this university recognizing an important piece of history for better and worse and taking steps to learn from it. And I think this center is the latest example of that, of acknowledging that Vanderbilt played an important role in obviously in the integration of SEC sports, but even more broadly than that, Perry's influence had ripple effects all over the country. And when you turn on the news now, race and sports is at the top of the headlines, just about every day. And the school has an important voice in that story through the story of Perry. And so I think it's really interesting to see, the story of an alum sort of work its way into the fabric of the school today.
Andrew, I think I understand fairly well with people who lived at the edges of that period or even the next generation, but I'm especially interested in what people, the reaction of people on campuses today, the young students as well as the athletes, when they come in contact and hear, often for the first time, about what Perry and Nate and so many other brave young men of that era went through.
Right. And I've also had the chance to meet with middle school students. I've adapted the book into a middle grade edition. So I was just meeting with 7th graders earlier today before coming, to this studio. And kids are surprised. Young people are surprised by what Perry went through on one hand. But on the other hand, unfortunately, a lot of Perry's story seems all too relevant today with some of the tensions that exist in this country. I think one of the things that surprises young people is the level of, I wouldn't say fear, but the concerns that Perry had for his own life. Stepping onto the basketball court, he told me that, he would imagine what's the worst thing that could happen in this situation on the road in the SEC. And in his mind, it was that he might get shot and killed out on the basketball court. And think about the time that this was, 1967, 68, people like Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, there were these very public assassinations of public figures. And so for Perry to have that concern really wasn't all that far-fetched. And so young people are, I think, surprised by that. They're also, I've seen some of the most poignant scenes, especially with elementary and middle school students, when they read a chapter about Perry being kicked out of a church. And he started attending a white church here in Nashville his freshman year on the advice of Clyde Lee, who had been a star player a year ahead of Perry. They had both grown up in Nashville in the Church of Christ, Clyde in the white church, Perry in an African-American church. And on his recruiting visit, Clyde said, "Perry, here's the closest Church of Christ to campus, right across the street." And so Perry starts going. And he said, growing up in segregated Nashville, he never would have thought about walking through the doors of a white church, but that this was what pioneering was all about, doing things that had never been done before. And so he has the courage to walk through the doors of this church. And on the 4th Sunday that he goes, he's pulled aside and told that he couldn't keep coming anymore, that there were members of the church who would write them out of the church out of their wills if Perry was allowed to keep coming to this church. And so before his first day of class as a freshman, this is August of his freshman year, he has to walk back to his dorm, and take off his coat and tie, and he's been kicked out of this church. And I remember speaking to a 4th and 5th grade group here in Nashville, and the kids were crying, and they said they couldn't understand. God loves everyone. How could you be kicked out of a church? And so, that scene will always stick with me.
It's extraordinary to think about. Andrew, you said something, and maybe even asking about this is not so dramatic after what you just got through saying, getting kicked out of a church, but 20 years. Why did it take that amount of time before this great university invited him back?
Right. Well, and I think this is something that you see in various forms whenever, or often I should say, an athlete speaks out, beyond sports. And so what Perry did is the day after his last game, he gave a very honest interview to the Tennessean, where he talked about the difficulties and the challenges that he had encountered as a Pioneer. And he said that he suspected in giving this interview that he was, quote unquote, writing his ticket out of town, and that a lot of people weren't going to want to hear the hard truth about being kicked out of a church, about professors using the N-word in his direction in a classroom, about Ole Miss canceling its games against Vanderbilt Perry's freshman year, about referees not calling fouls when he's hit in the face and bleeding, and the loneliness that he felt on his own campus, where he felt like he was denied his humanity. And he said that this was his last game. People wanted to have a happy picture, wrap this all up in a bow. They didn't want to hear how hard things had been. But he said he had a moral obligation to tell the truth for the benefit of the people that would come behind him, number one, but also for the university. He cared about Vanderbilt. He wanted to make it better. And he felt the only way he could do that was to tell the truth about what he had been through. This story runs on the front page of the Tennessean the next day, and Frank Sutherland, who wrote the article, told me that the phones rang off the hook. People calling to cancel their subscriptions, calling Perry Wallace ungrateful. And so all he had done was tell the truth, that there was a perception in the white community in Nashville that he was angry and that he hated Vanderbilt. And so that created this feeling that he should not be invited back to campus. Finally, it was C.M. Newton, after he comes to Vanderbilt as head basketball coach, who had admired Perry from a distance when he was coaching at Alabama, who said, "This isn't right. We have the Jackie Robinson of the SEC here at our school. We need to have a relationship with this person." So he finally invites Perry back in 1989 to speak to a booster group here in Nashville, and that sort of slowly began to break the ice. And for me, that was a significant event because I was here as a student in 1989, as a sophomore, read some articles about this person I'd never heard of, Perry Wallace, coming back to campus for the first time, and wrote a paper about him for a Black History course. And then 20 years later, that paper turned into my book.
Wow, it's interesting too, Andrew, and I know you talked to him about this, but C.M. Newton, while at Alabama, playing a very significant role in the recruitment. I believe it was Leon Douglas. I may have been mistaken, but that was not an easy thing to do either, especially at that time in Alabama.
That's right, and Wendell Hudson.
Hudson too, yeah.
Yeah, Coach Newton told me that he had a cross burned on his yard, after doing this. And he had, of course, the first all-black starting lineup in the SEC basketball and won 3 straight SEC championships. I had a chance to go down and visit with Coach Newton in Tuscaloosa for an article for The Undefeated. And I asked him, as a person who grew up in the South in the 30s, 40s, 50s, where did his views on race come from? And a lot of it goes back to his days playing minor league baseball, where one of his locker mates was a black Cuban player that he became friends with and was one of the best players on the team. And he began to realize that these notions that he had grown up hearing were all wrong, and that these were good people. And so that was really a part of the reason when he came to coach at the University of Alabama, he asked Coach Bryant, the athletic director, in addition to football coach, whether he could recruit anyone. And it was clear what he meant by that. And Coach Bryant said he could. And that was important to Coach Newton.
Extraordinary. Again, it is really amazing to hear these stories so many years later, Andrew, and how they resonate today, and the idea that this could have happened. The name of the book, again, Strong Inside, Perry Wallace and the collision of race and sports in the South and in college basketball. Just amazing. Thank you so very much for joining us again. Would love to continue this dialogue in the near future. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Paul. If anybody listening or watching has a school where they want to hear this story, I'd love to do it. So just invite me to your kid's school. I'd love to do it.
Wow. I hope people take you up on that. That would be an incredible and meaningful educational experience. Andrew, thank you. Appreciate it. Wow.
Thank you, Paul.
Extraordinary just to think about 20 years because someone's spoke out, and now we have it in so many other venues of the sports world. People speaking out and being castigated for that. We will take a break. More to come. More of your phone calls after this.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
Welcome back to the program. Second half is live and underway as we continue. Can't wait to talk to Andy Staples here in just a moment. Some really interesting conversation to get with Andy about Tim Brando in the final hour. Let's delve in a little deeper on Brett Bielema. Whatever happened to him? He was fired immediately after the Missouri game on the day after Thanksgiving, and has given an interview talking about what he has learned. And let's talk to the man who knows more than we do, and that is Andy Staples. Andy, always great to catch up with you. Sometimes when you get fired, you either pop back up in the news like Kevin Sumlin, or you are almost forgotten about, like Brett Bielema. But
how could you forget Brett Bielema?
Well,
come on.
I don't want to. I just have.
It's interesting. He's got some options now.
What's going on with him?
Well, he's had some NFL teams reach out to him, and obviously that's not for head coaching jobs. That's for assistant coaching or consultant type deals. And then there's television. Who I really would like to see Brett Bielema take a year and do some TV, because I think he'd be really good at it. The one idea I threw out in the column that I would love to see is, instead of a traditional broadcast crew, and I'm not talking about the 8 o'clock ABC game or the 8 o'clock ESPN game. I'm talking about one of the ones down the chain a little bit. Take away the traditional broadcast crew and have Brett Bielema and maybe another coach who's a really good talker just do a coach's film room broadcast of the game. I would love that, because, Bielema's one of those guys that you get him on TV, you wouldn't have to convince him to speak his mind. A lot of these coaches won't say exactly what they're thinking because they're afraid it'll keep them from getting another job. Brett's never been worried about that.
Well, Andy, there are a few things that I am an expert on, but I did spend 4 hours with Brett Bielema doing the film room for the first Alabama-Clemson game, and he was fabulous. I mean, funny, witty,
he's
clearly
quick on his feet.
He was unbelievable.
Yeah, I think he's born for it. The thing about it is I don't think you guys are going to get him for very long if he goes to that option. I think he'll wind up being a college head coach again at some point. When you have 3 Big Ten titles on your resume, somebody's going to give you a shot. I don't necessarily think that's going to be this year. The cycle is done with, but I think somebody's going to give him another chance based on what he did at Wisconsin. And, if you talk to him, he talked about the mistakes he made at Arkansas, and one of the big ones was taking a job that he didn't really know that much about. And I wonder about this sometimes, because you see it a lot in college football where a guy will take a job at a place he's never really been, doesn't really have any connection to, and maybe doesn't quite understand some of the nuances of the job. And at Arkansas, I think he thought he could just come and play the style he was playing at Wisconsin, and he'd be able to recruit all the players he needed, and they'd be able to go toe-to-toe with Alabama and Auburn and LSU year after year doing that. Well, guess what? If you can't recruit the best offensive lineman and the best defensive lineman, you're not going to win consistently playing that style in the SEC West. And that was a hard lesson he had to learn, and by the time he'd figured it out and tried to change his offensive style a little bit, I think it was probably too late.
In terms of the future, let's move beyond the current season that is about to go into full bloom, whether it's in college or pro, but where do you think, or what type of program do you think would be most interested in him?
I would think a Big Ten program definitely would, because he's proven he can win there. I think if Bill Snyder decides he's going to hang it up at Kansas State, that's a place where they would definitely consider Brett Bielema. And I think he's the kind of guy who, if he's in a place where you can compete with that style, he can win. I also think he's smart enough to adjust things. I look at Will Muschamp as a good example. Will Muschamp was a guy who will tell you about the mistakes he made when he got the job at Florida. And those mistakes ultimately cost him the job at Florida. He went and corrected those when he got the job at South Carolina. And, well, he underachieved at Florida. He has overachieved at South Carolina. So I think a smarter guy, and Brett Bielema is a very smart guy, I think will look at the mistakes he made and take a little bit of care and don't do it again. I think he's not going to take a job, I think, this time without having a really good idea what that job is. And I know that's hard sometimes, especially when you're going from one head coaching job to another, because you don't even want to call your friends and ask for advice because it might leak out that you're looking at another job, and that's going to be a problem. But you really do need that sort of information, because I think if he'd have had a better idea of what he needed to do at Arkansas to make that style work, he might have had second thoughts about taking it.
Andy, let me ask you about another coach who also lost his job. This man before the season, Hugh Freeze. There was a lot of talk that he was literally on the doorstep at Alabama. Someone even suggested that maybe he had the job and it was undone.
He wasn't consulting Nick Saban on his new Mercedes dealership?
Apparently not, and that is about to open, and I've already applied for a job. But what do we know any more about what happened with Freeze, and is he coming back anywhere?
Well, I think he'd like to, and here's the thing with Hugh Freeze. I look at his situation as being a little bit closer to Bobby Petrino's. What he got fired for at Ole Miss is a big deal within his family. It's a big deal for him. But in the grand scheme, does it keep him from ever being hireable again? I don't think so. Bobby Petrino, since he got fired at Arkansas, and you could maybe argue that what Petrino did was worse because he wound up using, Arkansas money to put somebody on the payroll. And Freeze didn't do that. He was using a university cell phone, which was his downfall. But I think it's one of those things where it's not going to keep him from ever getting another job. Now, here's where he's going to run into a problem. When he does get another job, it's going to be a little bit harder for him to recruit because he had an image that he was portraying, and the truth doesn't match that image. And he's going to have to work very hard to overcome that and explain what happened. And I think he's gone on this apology tour. He and his wife spoke at Liberty University last week, and he seems to understand what needs to be done. I don't think it's going to be that long before somebody takes a chance on him because, remember, you can say whatever you want. This is the guy who beat Alabama 2 years in a row. This is a guy who runs an offense that drives Nick Saban crazy. So somebody, and I don't know if it's necessarily somebody in the SEC, but somebody in college football is going to take a chance on him because it's not a situation like Art Briles where I don't know that he'll ever get another job. And what happened there, so many other people got hurt. Hugh Freeze hurt himself and his family. That's bad enough, but I don't necessarily think it's any worse than what Bobby Petrino did, and he's wound up getting 2 head coaching jobs since then.
Is it your sense that he was able to, because he maybe wasn't there when the sanctions came down, that the sanctions really didn't affect him that much, the Ole Miss sanctions? I
think it's because the NCAA didn't slap him with any more responsibility. They used that head coach responsibility legislation, but they didn't say, you did this specific thing or you did that specific thing. And I think that, more than anything, will help him as he looks for another job. Because if they'd said, Hugh Freeze did this and we have proof that Hugh Freeze broke this particular NCAA bylaw, then he would have a real hard time getting a job. But they don't have that. They have, he violated head coach responsibility, which is this big umbrella thing that says everybody who works for you is not supposed to break NCAA rules. Well, that's not always possible for the guy in charge to completely enforce. But that said, he's got a 2-game suspension if he's a head coach. But if you hire him as an offensive coordinator, he doesn't have a suspension.
Andy, I didn't mean to turn this into, let me hit you with every SEC head coach who currently
Feel free.
isn't. But we had a colleague of yours yesterday from Florida suggesting that maybe McElwain could possibly land in Tuscaloosa as an analyst. Have you heard anything about that?
That'd be a good spot if he did. I don't know exactly what his plans are right now. I think a year out of being head coach, coordinator type thing would probably be good to kind of decompress from the weirdness of what happened with him at Florida. It was a strange situation for Jim McElwain the last year at Florida. And talked to people who knew him back when he was coaching at Alabama who said he didn't even seem like himself anymore. So I think it's a case where that job it got really strange really fast. And it may take a year or so away from that. And you want to do a year away in familiar environment, Alabama, where you worked before, where you're not under the pressure of having to be the guy who calls the plays or the guy who makes all the decisions about recruits. That's a good way to decompress, yet stay in the game, and then be ready to go next year.
Andy, Sunday is not only the biggest television event of the year, it's also, I think, the biggest eating day of the year. So I ask you, as the connoisseur of all foods everywhere, at least connected to college football and pro football or sports in general, what do you got on the table?
I'm a wing guy for the Super Bowl. I don't know what it was that made me decide I like to eat wings during the Super Bowl, but for the last 10 or so years, that's been my thing. So now I have to decide, do I want to let the pros handle it? Do I want to smoke wings myself? I do love a good smoked wing, but where I live, we don't have anywhere who makes a really good smoked wing. I can make them better than the restaurants here. So the question is, am I going to be lazy and buy them from somewhere, or am I going to go to the grocery store, get my big green egg fired up, and get rolling on Sunday? I think it's probably choice B.
I'm sure the restaurants in Florida are really happy to know that you can do a better job than them.
At certain things. Now, they fry gator tail better than I ever could. But I don't want to go collect it either.
Got it. Always a pleasure. Andy, thanks for the time.
Thanks, Paul.
Andy Staples joining us from Gainesville. Always cool to talk to him. Tim Brando. He's with us in the final hour. Talk about revving up the stove. We'll be right back with your phone calls. Cal, Rick, what do you say?
Paul, thanks for taking my call. $12 million?
Just short of $12 million. That will buy you a lot of diapers for the new kid.
You ain't kidding. Let me tell you something. He and I have something in common. We both have totally outkicked the coverage when it comes to our spouses. Look, I have to break my back every day going to work. This guy, he should be on a beach.
Rick, I don't know. Could somebody get me a job where I get fired and get $12 million? I mean, and not only get fired, but I mean, let's be honest. I mean, we all love Brett Bielema.
Yeah.
What kind of job did he do this year?
No, I mean, it's unbelievable what these guys. And listen, you're worth what they pay you, in my opinion. I don't care what anybody says. I'll argue that to the day I die. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, he obviously didn't earn, if you want to look at it that way. But you're worth what you pay you, what they'll pay you, and that's just crazy. But yeah, if I were that dude, I mean, listen, I'd be on the beach every week. Just staring
for
at my
nearly
wife,
$12 million. Do they give it to you in one shot, or how does that work?
I think he gets a payoff, but then it's automatically taxed. So I don't know. It's like the lottery. He's not walking away with $12 million.
I mean, are you able to apply the new tax laws to that?
That's right. Well, I think they do actually.
Okay.
I want to defend Darryl here. I'm a 50-plus year Alabama fan, as you well know. And I've got years on Darryl. I would imagine. I would assume I'm quite a bit older. And here's my defense of Darryl. He hit the nail on the head. I mean, we can all cover it up as much as we want, but if Wisconsin doesn't lose that game, then they're in that title game. So we do some gratitude, believe it or not, to Ohio State. And a lot of things went Alabama's way. I mean, there's no denying that the calls went Alabama's way. And I can understand his situation. You're talking about 37 years of frustration, and to lose the game that way. If Alabama goes in there and blows out Georgia, we don't hear from Darryl. We do hear from Darryl.
It's all good. Yeah.
You don't have that itch.
No, I mean, Rick. Let me say, if I had said to you, okay, I'm coming out to SoCal, we're gonna go sit in a bar, 3:00 in the afternoon, right. And for the next hour, we're going to come up with the most evil way for Georgia to lose to Alabama. We could not have come up with a better script.
No, absolutely not.
I mean, Steven Spielberg could not have come up with a better script.
No, and so in his defense, I mean, that would eat it just about anybody. And look at how Alabama lost last year. Yeah. I compartmentalized a little bit better than Darryl. I mean, that next day I had to go to work, and I'll be quite honest with you, man, I had forgotten about it. But I understand that his situation after 37 years. Alabama had won 4 titles in 8 years. So it's a little bit easier.
But Alabama last year basically said, okay, we lost, we'll be back next year.
Yeah, and Georgia, listen, I'm telling you right now, I'll go on record. Georgia's going to win 3 national titles.
I think Rick said Georgia's going to win 3 national championships, and immediately, like he was struck by lightning. I didn't hear the end of it. Let's continue with more phone calls. JT is up next. What do you say, JT?
Hey, Paul, I was calling about Auburn's basketball team this year. I think we're built to go to the Final Four, even though Daniel Purfoy and Austin Wiley are going to be out for the rest of the year. What do you think? Or Austin Wiley, for sure. not yet on Daniel.
Yeah, I'm still a little. I'm waiting on that. But I just want to make sure there are no other shoes to drop before I'm going to pick Auburn to go to the Final Four.
I hear you there. I just feel like they're built for March, but I may be a little biased being from Auburn.
Yeah, no, I understand. Well, I'm not biased, and I'm just. I mean, I like everything Bruce has done. I just. I'd like to see a little more before I make that declaration. Nick is up next. Nick, go right ahead.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for taking my call. I'm a proud Alabama alumnus and former scholarship athlete at the Capstone.
Wow.
So it's a nice segue. It's about time in the show for a sophisticated call. and what I mean by that, it's a topic that's relevant today. We're in the throes of college basketball. And no offense, you're talking about Brett Bielema and other coaches that have fallen into the dustbin of history. Okay? Now, I'd hoped I'd got on the call prior to you speaking with Coach Avery, because I think they've underperformed. You have Colin Sexton's going to be playing for the Bulls this time next year. Avery Johnson is very magnanimous and a great personality, and boy, you've taken him hook, line, and sinker. I've heard you speak.
Hold on a second.
I've heard you ask Coach Saban more difficult questions than Coach Avery, Coach Johnson.
Well,
so he wins Oklahoma. This team is going to be out in the first round of the SEC tournament. Will not make the NCAA tournament. And let me tell you, I'm having flashbacks.
No, hold on a second, Nick. You're saying Alabama will not make
hold
on. Alabama will not make the NCAA tournament?
They will not.
Okay.
They will not. And I hope that you have me back on when that's prophetic. So I know that you have the chops to be a hard-hitting journalist. I've heard you before.
I love that. By the way, I'm appreciating.
And all of a sudden, you melt, asking him layups like, wow, what did it feel like to beat Oklahoma? Like, that matters. Okay? This is real sports. You got Jim and Dill and these guys talking about
Nick, slow down a second.
The drunk guys at the end of the bar that are falling off the stool, and nothing about what's going on in today SEC athletics. I mean, let's get back to where this show matters about something relevant.
Okay.
And I'm talking about
Nick,
Alabama basketball
are you going to preach, or are we going to have a conversation?
No, go ahead, Paul. I'm sorry.
Okay. So you want me to turn this show into hard-hitting, cutting-edge, cut through the BS, cut through the propaganda? Is that what you want?
I want to mix. I want to mix. You've got these guys that come on and ramble on about nothing. Probably couldn't name, 5 starters for Alabama's football team.
Okay.
We're in the throes of SEC basketball, which, let me tell you,
by the way,
Alabama
you're trying to say we're in the throes of SEC basketball.
Football and basketball up for Alabama.
Last week we talked to Frank Martin. We talked to Bruce Pearl. We talked to
callers. I'm talking about callers now. Not
I don't control the callers, though, my friend. I mean, I'm just a trained SEAL here taking phone calls.
Oh, come on! You do a very good job of self-loathing and self-deprecation, but you're very good at what you do. And I've been a long-time listener and a long-time watcher of the show. And I called about the XFL, earlier last week,
right?
And we had a nice discussion about that.
Okay.
And my only point is that, look, we're in basketball season. Alabama right now is underperforming the talent that they have. Colin Sexton's going to be playing for the Bulls.
No,
He's going to have to go out and
hold on. Alabama's beaten Auburn. They've beaten Oklahoma. They had a.
Are they ranked? Hey, Paul, let me ask you: Are they ranked in the top 25?
And does it matter if you're ranked in college basketball? What does that have to do with anything?
Of course it does.
It doesn't make a bit of difference.
It does. It helps whether or not you're going to get a good seed in the tournament.
You are mistaken about that. I think the most irrelevant thing in sports is the AP top 25 in college basketball.
Well, I've watched them play. I've watched them play probably the 6th most meaningful games this year. I see a team that's underperforming. Now, hey, that's my opinion. I'm no basketball expert.
And by the way,
I'm
not trying to claim I'm an expert. You started this conversation off attacking me for my softball questions to Avery Johnson, who came on the program after what is easily his biggest win at Alabama, and you're criticizing me for not asking what?
Well, that was like a PR tour. That's like, Jeff Bezos going around and saying, hey, we're going to change health care. Ask some hard-hitting questions. Say, hey, look.
I mean, what are you talking about?
Coach Johnson, the Oklahoma win was great. How are you going to climb back into the top 25?
Well, because I think that's an illegitimate question myself, but give me another question I should have asked.
Well, I also would have said, hey, look, that's a great win. How do you see you moving into the SEC tournament? How are you going to get to the championship game? Alabama has been mediocre.
Nick, let me offer this to you, okay? And I don't claim to be the world's greatest interviewer.
Come on, Paul.
But I must confess,
you're a very, very good interviewer. That's why I was so disappointed in the interview. He's cast you under his spell, and I will say he's very magnanimous. He's got a great personality. I don't want to see Alabama basketball.
I got an I love Avery button on right now under my jacket.
A 10-year.
Do me a favor, Nick. I have to run. Not cutting you off. But can I leave you on hold, because I want to make sure you leave our phone screen or your number. I want to come to your interviewing seminar down in Florida beginning next weekend, because I need some help. Thanks for the call. We will take a short break. Back with more.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
Put a little cherry on the top.
Welcome back to the program. Glad you're with us, and it's always a great pleasure to welcome our next guest. I said earlier, and I think I was right about this, Tim Brando, you were the very first guest on the Finebaum Show back in the late 80s, and you have been among the most frequent, not frequent enough, but welcome to the program. So great to have you on.
I had put myself in a personal ban because you'd really not been yourself until about the last 10 minutes of yesterday's show. And then I said, maybe Jonathan will have me on. I'm going to reach out. And that's how it happened. So, Paul, again, it's good to see the old Paul back.
Well,
Jim was right. The old Paul is back, and for that reason, I'm back.
Well, you need to, because our mutual colleague on Twitter, Jim from Tuscaloosa, has said ever since I've been ESPNized, and you were like a. What's the like one of the Gemini 7 at ESPN? I mean, you were the first group of astronauts here, so you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Listen,
Mercury 7.
James Andrew Miller, by
Mercury
the way.
7.
James Andrew Miller, who did that deep dive on Game Day. I don't know if you heard that or not, but it really brought back a lot of memories. And Jonathan actually evoked some of those memories yet again today when he pulled out that old pic of Vince Dooley and I together today. So I have wonderful memories of those days when Jim and I was becoming Apollo in Bristol.
Yeah. Exactly. It was a great listen. Yeah, you're right. And I loved hearing you curse on that podcast, Tim.
Well, I did a Bornstein impression,
you did.
It had to include that. And they say it's okay if it's on, if it's a podcast.
No, and I've never heard you curse in real life, so it was a new experience for me.
And you won't. No. But again, that was a guy that championed me in my early days there, and I have great memories of him, too. It's amazing how many people I heard from after that podcast dropped. I mean, from all different corners of my career. So I was happy that, not a lot of people go back that far when they're doing a history of ESPN, and I thought it was nice that Jim.
No, I tell you, we had Jim on, and I think it is this Origins podcast is one of the most fascinating things I've listened to. So I'm glad you.
You learn something all the time. I learned some things about Game Day that I had forgotten. So it was, but more than anything else, it was just nice to be included.
Tim, you cover, I don't know, like 10 basketball games a week for Fox and Fox Sports. So but there are a number of things I want to ask you, but especially I wanted to ask you about your recent experience at Michigan State and try to help us better understand what it was like up there when all this started falling from the sky, and what does the path look like for the future, especially for Mark D'Antonio and Tom Izzo.
Well, Paul, I don't know when I'm going to write the memoirs, when I'm going to write the book, but I will tell you that that day, that Friday in East Lansing, and the hours leading up to the start of that game, and in fact even to last minutes before I went on the air at 8 o'clock are going to right up there with the Georgia Dome being hit by a tornado when we were doing the 2008 SEC basketball tournament, or right up there with, I think, in my second year at FS1, getting ready to call a college football game in Stillwater, and Spencer Tillman and I, on our way to the game, it was homecoming, were walking over body bags because some maniac decided to drive through a barricade and run over people in a parade at Oklahoma State. And we opened the football game with an obituary. Those are very challenging moments for a broadcaster. Whenever you're in a position where the game itself isn't the thing, it's something besides the game. But the old legendary cowboy and mentor to me, Kurt Gowdy, said to me years ago, as a mentor to me in the 80s, he said, "Kid, you got to remember, they don't always pay us for what we do, but for what we might have to do." And that was one of those days in East Lansing. I had just had Michigan State at Illinois a week earlier, and I had no idea that I would be back there in East Lansing with a story like this popping. You got to remember, the Outside the Line story was coming on at 6 o'clock. Our game was at 8 o'clock. I saw probably the first 15 to 20 minutes of the report. Then at the arena, after I'd gone to the shoot-around earlier that day, we knew what was coming down. I talked to Tom as much as I could talk to Tom, and full disclosure, he and I are close. He's a really, really good man and a whale of a basketball coach, already a Hall of Famer. But this was one of those where my opinion of him or any of his accomplishments would have nothing to do with what I had to do. You know, I had to report the facts as they were at that given time, talk about where we were going and what the allegations were, and what the reactions to those allegations from both Tom's point of view, the football coach Mark D'Antonio, who, by the way, had an impromptu news conference at 7:40, 20 minutes before the game started. And I sent Ethan Cooperson, who's our content coordinator and statistician for all my games, I had him stay up there so he could tell me what D'Antonio was saying, so that in that 2-minute open I could get all of those moving parts together and make people understand what was going on and the impact that story was having on the university, but more specifically the basketball program and the football program and the coach who had a game to play. So it was as unique a situation as I think I found myself in, and I mentioned those other two circumstances: the Georgia Dome situation at the SEC tournament, and the holiday, the parade for homecoming at Oklahoma State, as being some that just will always be in the back of my mind. Like I had no idea when I got there it would be quite like this kind of routine, but that's what we had to deal with. And the aftermath of it, when I got through with the game, Paul, I was mentally exhausted. You know, it was like the game seemed so secondary, and yet we had to cover a game as well. It was bizarre.
What do you think, based on your sense of being on the ground there, what do you think, and where do you think this is all going?
I'm hearing a lot from a number of people in our business that it's time that Tom Izzo speak up. And I'm not surprised at all that OTL sent their reporters to Maryland for the game over the weekend to once again try to get him to speak up. But this is always the case in intercollegiate athletics. No one should be surprised that Tom is being forced to keep his mouth shut. The attorneys for the school simply don't want him to address the matter right now. And until such time as we get to a point where they feel like the investigation has gotten to a certain point where they'll be comfortable with what he's going to say, then he's not going to be able to say anything. I do believe, and I had to broach this subject with him, literally one of the great things about Tom is that unlike a lot of head coaches who make these big appearances when they're coming out right before the opening tip, he's an old assistant coach for Judd Heathcote, and he always comes out for the warm-up 20 minutes before tip. So there was, I think, a fake Wojnarowski report, Adrian Wojnarowski report that he was going to retire at the end of the season. Turned out that was not Adrian's report. It was some fake account. But at the time, I didn't know that. I had to ask him about it. And he was like, Tim, I mean, you got to be kidding. No way am I going to do that. He says, look, I know you got a job to do. I'm here to tell you I'm not retiring. I said, okay, I just needed to know that. So I went over and talked to him about that. The defiant reaction from D'Antonio was far different from the more contrite response that you heard, I think, in the post-game presser after that game from Izzo. I think he tried to strike a chord of contrition and understanding that this was well beyond just his basketball program, but a university issue. But his being lumped into it in such a manner, particularly at the top of that report, Paul, is one that was obviously going to get great attention, much more attention than any of the other sports that may be involved. And we all know that this is an offshoot off what has been a remarkable story of a real-life monster who clearly did a lot of bad things for a very long time at that university without their having any knowledge of it. Or if they did have knowledge of it, certainly they didn't do anything about it. And that's the reason for the report. But I do think that Izzo, when he gets his opportunity, you can almost see it the other day when he was being questioned by the young OTL reporter about it. You could almost see on his face that he really wanted to talk. I mean, as she's asking the question, he's holding himself back. You know, if he's guilty of anything, he's too honest. And I think because he's so honest, he's having to really, it's a hard thing for him to do, to keep his mouth shut. Eventually he's going to talk, and the sooner probably the better. But at this time, the school just has in their minds too much to lose if he does talk.
Chatting with Tim Brando. Tim, before you go, I do want to get your thoughts on, I realize you're all over the country covering college basketball, but you still know the SEC extremely well, having covered it for countless years. Some are promoting it as the best in the country, especially coming off of Saturday's win over the Big 12.
Yeah.
What is where do you have the SEC right now? What does it mean to you?
It's right up there, Paul. I mean, the ACC is going to get more teams in, but the SEC's right now, they're going to get probably 8 teams in, possibly 9. I mean, Kentucky, Florida, Tennessee, Auburn, Alabama, Arkansas, A&M, and Missouri. And I know some people, like Arkansas fans, are going, wait a minute, aren't they at the bottom of the league? Well, it's not just about what you do in your league. It's about what you've done outside your league and the strength of your opponents and opponents' opponents. But Missouri has slipped and A&M has slipped somewhat. But right now, those teams right now would be both with our guy, Howie Schwab, and your guy, Joe Lunardi. They got them in, and they should have them in. I thought it was significant for the SEC to get that 6-4 win over the Big 12 because I think everyone thought coming into the season that the Big 12 was the best league. And until West Virginia hit the skids in the last week and dropped a couple of games and let that big lead at halftime go down to a defeat against Kentucky, probably the feeling was the Big 12 was the best league. I don't think it is now. And I think the SEC Big 12 Challenge has a lot to do with that. And again, I applaud both leagues and ESPN for putting that thing together because it gets people to talk about college basketball at a time when it's really critical. Just as the North Carolina-Duke game next week when I come in will get people to talk about college basketball after the Super Bowl. I would say that the ACC, the SEC, and the Big 12 are probably 1, 2, 3 right now. But the SEC by far and away is the most surprising conference. And that its renaissance in so many ways has to be given, interestingly, to an old Big East mind. And I think you've had him on your show recently. Mike Tranghese, the former commissioner of that league, was brought in by the Southeastern Conference as a consultant. He not only helped them from a scheduling standpoint to make sure that coaches weren't scheduling just enough wins to get into any postseason, but scheduling enough wins and the kind of RPI wins to get you in the tournament. And also where the next great young coaches or maybe other coaches that have been in the NBA would like to come and be in the league. And restoration of the conference in basketball has been immense. I just hope that the fans there begin to understand and appreciate it. I love seeing the crowd that Alabama had. And that kid in their backcourt, Sexton, just did an unbelievable job against Trae Young. And Avery deserves a lot of credit. And for Alabama to be that good and Arkansas to be that good again, man, for Mike Anderson to get that thing going at the bigger barn, as they like to call it, at Bud Walton Arena, that's extra special. So not since really, I think, the maybe 80s to the mid-90s when the SEC was really good, have I seen this conference with as much hope and promise as it has right now.
Great stuff. Tim Brando, he'll be on a television near you pretty much every night this week.
Okay, buddy.